Nobody in the town of Hollow Creek expected that day to be different from any other. The sun beat down on the red clay of the Georgia lowlands the way it had for centuries, and the enslaved men and women bent their backs in the cotton fields the way they would for generations to come, had fate not had other plans. Dust rose in slow spirals along the narrow road that cut through the lands of Colonel Augustus Whitfield Thornton, a man whose name was spoken in low tones, as if saying it aloud might draw the attention of those dark, unforgiving eyes. Augustus owned everything the eye could see, from the rolling hills blanketed in white cotton to the river that meandered lazily between moss-draped oaks. And yet, he owned absolutely nothing that brought him peace. Thornfield Plantation, with its grand white-columned house and sweeping wraparound porches, was the beating heart of that corner of the world. But anyone who knew the house from inside knew that the heart had stopped beating 2 years ago, the day Miss Eleanor was found lifeless in her bed, her face serene and her hands folded across her chest as though she had chosen to depart in silence without causing trouble to anyone. The fever took her in 3 days. 3 days that transformed Augustus Thornton from a man who was stern but fair into a walking block of granite. The enslaved people whispered among themselves that the master had buried his heart alongside his wife, and what remained was merely the shell of a man, hard, cold, and impenetrable. The daughters, however, were another story entirely. Mary Clare, the elder, was 9 years old and had her mother's brown eyes, those eyes that seemed to see beyond visible things. She was a child far too serious for her age, carrying on her narrow shoulders a responsibility no child should have to bear, being mother to her younger sister, because someone had to be, and their father certainly was not volunteering for the role. Annabeth, 5 years old, was the opposite, a storm of laughter and questions and skinned knees, who still did not understand why her mother would not come back and why her father no longer smiled. Annabeth asked every night before sleep when Mama would return from the stars. And every night, Mary Clare invented a different answer, because the truth was too heavy for either of them. The house was maintained by old Gertrude, an enslaved woman of nearly 60, who had served Miss Eleanor since before the marriage, and who, with the mistress's passing, had assumed everything: the cooking, the sewing, the care of the girls, the entire running of the big house. But Gertrude was aging. Her hands, which once braided Eleanor's hair with the precision of an artist, now trembled. Her knees protested at every staircase, and her eyes could no longer find the needle with the ease of years past. Augustus knew this, though he would not say so. He knew he needed another enslaved woman to help with the girls, someone younger, with the energy to keep up with Annabeth's wild runs through the orchard, and the patience to endure Mary Clare's endless questions. That was why, on a Tuesday morning that seemed in no way special, Augustus mounted his bay horse and rode into town, where the trader Tiberius kept a slave market behind his hardware store. Augustus did not care for the place, not because he felt any remorse. The institution was to him as natural as the rising sun, but because Tiberius was an unpleasant man with sour breath and an easy laugh, who treated human beings with the same indifference he showed toward rusted nails. Augustus entered the dim enclosure, hat in hand, wearing his usual closed expression, and said only 3 words: "I need someone." Tiberius showed him 5 women. 2 were robust, with calloused hands, clearly raised for field work. A third was very young, nearly a child, with eyes so wide with fear that Augustus felt a discomfort he chose not to examine. The 4th was sick, a dry, persistent cough that betrayed compromised lungs. And then there was the 5th. She was in the corner, seated on a wooden crate, her back straight and her hands resting on her knees, with an elegance that seemed absurd in that context. Her eyes were the deepest brown Augustus had ever seen, not like chocolate or wet earth, but like the dark waters of a river in shadow, where one knows there is depth, but cannot measure how much. She did not look at him when he approached, not from fear or submission, but with the calm of someone who had already decided that fear would solve nothing. Tiberius informed him her name was Hope. She was 24 years old. She came from a plantation in the Carolina upcountry, where she had served as a nursemaid. She was baptized, knew her prayers, and had a reputation for being good with children. Augustus asked nothing more. He paid what was asked, signed the papers, and said he would send for her. Hope arrived at Thornfield Plantation on a late afternoon, when the sky was painted in orange and purple, as if the universe itself wished to mark the moment with some solemnity. She descended from the wagon with a single cloth bundle, everything she owned in the world, and stood before the big house for an instant too long. Gertrude, watching from the kitchen door, thought the girl was admiring the architecture. But Hope was not looking at the house. She was looking at the two little girls who spied on her from the second-floor window, their faces pressed against the glass and their eyes wide with curiosity. The first meeting between Hope and Augustus's daughters took place that very evening, in the girls' room under Gertrude's watchful gaze. Mary Claire spoke first with that adult gravity that was her hallmark. "Are you going to be our new slave?" The word stung Hope like a stone, but she did not let it show. She answered in a gentle voice, "I have come to take care of you." Mary Claire examined her with narrowed eyes like a judge evaluating a defendant, and then delivered her verdict. "You have pretty eyes. You can stay." Annabeth, less diplomatic, simply threw herself into Hope's arms as if she had known her for years, and asked if she knew how to make cornhusk dolls. Hope did. Hope knew how to do many things those girls could not imagine. She knew how to braid hair with wildflowers. She knew how to tell stories of animals that spoke and rivers that sang. She knew how to brew herb tea for fevers and make mud poultices for insect bites. She knew how to sing songs in a language no one on that plantation recognized. Ancient words, carried across the ocean by her grandmother, who had come in the belly of a ship and survived everything one can survive. And above all, Hope knew how to listen. In a world where no one listened to children, she heard every word as though it were gold. The first days were ones of mutual observation. Hope learned the rhythms of the house, the master's moods, the secrets whispered among the enslaved in the quarters. She learned that Augustus took his coffee black at dawn, alone on the porch, staring at the cotton fields like a man staring at an enemy he must face every day. She learned that he dined in silence with his daughters seated at the table, and that the only words he directed at them were corrections. "Sit up straight, do not speak with your mouth full, finish your soup." She learned that he never kissed them, never embraced them, never told them he loved them, and she learned in Mary Claire's eyes that the child knew exactly what that silence meant. Gertrude instructed her during those first days. She showed her where everything was, how the master liked things done, what the invisible rules of the house were. "Do not look him in the eye," was the first rule. "Do not speak unless he asks you to. Do not linger in the hallways. Do not sing near the big house." Hope listened to everything attentively and stored each instruction, not because she intended to follow them all, but because she wanted to understand the terrain she walked upon before deciding her own steps. In the second week, the first incident occurred that would change the household's dynamics. Annabeth fell from the peach tree in the yard, a hard fall nearly 6 feet, and began screaming with that intensity only 5-year-old children can produce. Mary Claire ran inside for help. The enslaved workers in the yard approached, but did not know what to do, and the overseer appeared saying he would notify the master. But before anyone could act, Hope was already there. She knelt in the dirt, gathered Annabeth in her arms with a gentle firmness, examined the arm it was not broken, thank God, only badly bruised, and began to sing. A quiet song, almost a murmur, in a melody that seemed to come from somewhere very old and very far away. And the most extraordinary thing happened. Annabeth stopped crying. When Augustus arrived, breathless and paler than usual, he found Annabeth in Hope's lap, her arm wrapped in a clean cloth, still whimpering softly, but visibly calmed. The scene stopped him in his tracks. He stood in the doorway watching an enslaved woman hold his daughter with more tenderness than he himself could offer, and felt something shift inside his chest, something he immediately pushed back down, the way one forces a drawer shut. "Thank you," he said, and the word sounded strange in his mouth, as if the mechanism producing it had grown rusty. Hope merely inclined her head, without releasing Annabeth. Augustus stood there a moment longer, not knowing what to do with his own hands, and then turned and left. That night, in the quarters, Hope heard stories. Old Joanna, the eldest on the plantation, told her about Miss Eleanor, how she was kind, how she treated the enslaved people with a decency that was rare, how she loved those girls with a ferocity that seemed to consume all the air in the world around her. She told how the master was different before, not exactly gentle but present, alive, capable of laughter. She told of the night Eleanor died, how Augustus's scream echoed across the entire plantation, and how from that day forward, silence claimed everything. "It is as if he died along with her," said old Joanna, chewing on a piece of sugarcane. Only his body forgot to stop. Hope thought about those words for a long time, lying on her pallet, listening to the crickets singing outside. She thought about the man with hard eyes who did not know how to embrace his own daughters. She thought about the girl who carried the weight of the world, and the other who still waited for her mama to come back from the stars. And she thought about a feeling she had no right to feel, a strange compassion, mixed with something that felt dangerously like identification. The weeks that followed transformed Thornfield Plantation in ways no one could have predicted. The girls attached themselves to Hope with a speed that frightened Gertrude and unsettled the master. Annabeth took to following her everywhere like a cheerful little shadow, clinging to Hope's skirt while she worked, asking questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? Why do ants walk in lines? Why does Hope have darker skin? This last question made Hope pause for a moment before answering. Because the sun liked me so much, he spent extra time painting me. Annabeth found this perfectly logical and ran off to tell her sister that the sun was a painter. Mary Clare, however, was more cautious. She observed Hope with those ancient eyes, testing her, measuring her, searching for flaws. She asked difficult questions. Why can you not leave whenever you want? Why does father get to tell you what to do? Did you ever have a family? Hope answered with honesty, measured by care, truth filtered through love. She said yes, she had once had a family, but life separated them. She said there were things in the world that were not fair, and that one day Mary Clare would understand better. She said that as long as she was there, she would care for her and Annabeth as if they were her own. That last phrase was what broke Mary Clare's resistance. The child, who for 2 years had been stronger than any child her age should have to be, finally found someone she could trust. And when she trusted, she crumbled, in the good way, like a wall that falls to make room for a garden. She began seeking Hope in the middle of the night when she had nightmares. She began resting her head in Hope's lap while listening to stories. She began to smile again, and that smile, when Augustus glimpsed it for the first time in months, was like a ray of sunlight entering through a crack in a dark room. Augustus began noticing changes he did not know how to process. The girls were happier. The house seemed more alive. There were flowers in the vases. Hope gathered them from the fields every morning, and songs that drifted through the windows when she believed no one was listening. The kitchen smelled of spices Gertrude did not know, seasonings Hope carried in her memory from another life. And the girls, his girls, were blooming in a way he had not seen since Eleanor was alive. He did not know what to do with this. His first reaction was suspicion, the natural reaction of a man who had learned that everything one loves can be taken away. But the suspicion found nothing to support itself upon, because Hope did nothing wrong. She was impeccable in her work, respectful in her conduct, present when needed and invisible when appropriate. The only extraordinary thing she did was love his daughters with a generosity that seemed inexhaustible. It was on a rainy Sunday that the dynamic truly began to shift. Sundays were the hardest days at the plantation because there was no work to distract and the hours dragged heavily. The girls were restless, confined to the parlor by the storm, and Augustus was in his study trying to read, but the truth was, he could not concentrate. The girls' shouts and laughter pierced the walls, and he was about to call someone to silence them when he heard something different. Hope was telling a story. Augustus had not intended to listen, but her voice had a magnetic quality, low, rhythmic, with inflections that rose and fell like waves. He approached the study door and stood there, listening through the gap. The story was about a bird that had lost its voice and needed to cross an enchanted forest to find it again. Each tree in the forest offered a different sound, the whisper of the wind, the crash of thunder, the song of the rivers. but none was the bird's true voice. Until, at the very heart of the forest, the bird found a silence so deep that it could hear its own heart. And it was there, in that silence, that its voice finally returned. Not the voice from before, but a new one, deeper, truer. Augustus realized with a start that his eyes were wet. He closed the study door in silence and sat down in his chair, staring at his own hands, trying to understand what he had just felt. It was as though someone had found a locked door inside him and turned the key just a little, just enough to let a sliver of light enter. But what happened next changed everything forever. It was Mary Claire who sparked the change, without knowing what she was doing. One evening at dinner, as Augustus carved the meat in silence and the girls ate obediently, Mary Claire said with the naturalness of someone remarking on the weather, "Father, Hope says every person has a star in the sky that shines just for them. Which one is yours?" Augustus stopped carving. He looked at his daughter, not knowing what to say. No one had ever asked him such a question. The questions he received were about crops, prices, debts, property lines. No one asked him about stars. "I do not know," he said at last. "Hope knows," said Annabeth with the authority of someone in possession of privileged information. "She knows all the stars. She showed me Mama's." The silence that followed was so dense it seemed to have weight. Augustus felt the air leave him. Mama's. Eleanor had a star. Someone in this house was speaking of Eleanor to his daughters, returning to them something he, with his silence, had tried to erase, because erasing was easier than remembering, and remembering was easier than feeling. He said nothing. He finished his supper, went upstairs and closed the door, but he did not sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to the wind in the trees, and for the first time in 2 years allowed himself to think of Eleanor without trying to smother the thought. He remembered her laugh, the way she held the girls, the jasmine perfume she wore, the last conversation they had, about nothing important, about what to plant in the garden. He would trade everything, absolutely everything, for one more conversation about nothing important. From that night forward, something changed in the way Augustus looked at Hope. Before, she had been invisible, a functional piece in the machinery of the house. Now he saw her. He saw the way she arranged Annabeth's hair with infinite patience. He saw how she sat on the floor, to be at the girls' eye level when she spoke to them. He saw how her hands moved when she told stories, drawing in the air cities and forests and oceans that existed only in the imagination. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the dignity in her gestures, the quiet strength in her bearing. And he began, almost without realizing it, to find reasons to be in the same rooms she was in. One day he went to the kitchen, where he never went, to ask Gertrude something trivial, and stood watching Hope knead biscuit dough with Annabeth hanging from her neck. Another day he went to the garden, where he never went, supposedly to inspect the rose bushes, and found Hope teaching Mary Claire to identify medicinal plants. On a third day, he appeared in the parlor at the precise moment Hope was telling one of her stories, and sat down in a chair in the corner, pretending to read a book, but listening to every word. Hope noticed everything. She had the heightened perception of someone who had learned to read environments in order to survive. She knew when someone was watching her. She knew how to distinguish a gaze of surveillance from a gaze of curiosity. And Augustus's gaze was something new. It was not the gaze of a master toward a slave, nor that of a man toward a woman. It was the gaze of someone trying to decipher something he did not understand. A gaze that said, "I do not know what you are, but I know you are important." She should have felt afraid. At another plantation with another master, that kind of attention would have meant danger. But Hope had a refined intuition, and something inside her said that Colonel Augustus Thornton, for all his hardness, was not a cruel man. He was a broken man, and there was an enormous difference between the two. The incident that sealed the connection came on a night when Annabeth took ill with fever. A high fever, the kind that makes a child delirious and trembling, the kind that transforms any father into a desperate creature. Augustus was awakened by Mary Claire, who knocked on his bedroom door at 3 a.m, her eyes red and her voice shaking. "Father, Beth is terribly hot." Augustus ran down and found Hope already in the girls' room, holding Annabeth in her arms, pressing cool cloths to the child's forehead and murmuring prayers and songs in a blend of English and a tongue he did not recognize. Gertrude, summoned in haste, was brewing teas in the kitchen, but the one in command was Hope. She knew remedies no apothecary in the county possessed. She brewed infusions from roots and leaves she had gathered from the woods, wrapped the child's feet in warm compresses, and kept her hydrated with tiny sips of honey water. And through the entire night she did not leave Annabeth's side. Augustus stayed as well. He sat in the chair beside the bed, and he stayed. For the first time, with every wall torn down by the terror of losing a daughter, he was not the colonel, not the master of the plantation, not anything. He was simply a father, terrified. And when, around 5 in the morning, the fever began to break, and Annabeth finally fell asleep with calm, even breathing, Augustus looked at Hope, whose face was damp with sweat and marked by the sleepless night, and said, his voice hoarse, "I do not know what I would do without you." It was the most sincere sentence he had spoken in 2 years, and Hope knew it. She knew by the tone, by the way the words came out, not as a courtesy but as a confession wrenched from the very bottom of his chest. She simply nodded, because answering with words would have made the moment too large, and moments too large frighten men like Augustus. And no one could have predicted what she would do next. In the days that followed, Hope did not mention that night. She did not seek closeness, did not force intimacy, did not attempt to capitalize on Augustus's moment of vulnerability. She simply continued being what she had always been, present, capable, loving toward the girls. And that normalcy was what disarmed Augustus the most. He was prepared to deal with schemers, with manipulators, with women who wielded beauty as a weapon. The world he inhabited was full of them, widows from town who arrived bearing cakes and poorly disguised intentions. But he was not prepared for someone who simply loved without asking for anything in return. The weeks passed, and Hope's presence became so woven into the fabric of plantation life that it was impossible to imagine the place without her. The girls adored her, with an intensity that surpassed the bond between an enslaved nursemaid and the children in her care. It was pure love, the kind that recognizes no hierarchies or boundaries. Annabeth had taken to calling her my Hope, possessive and affectionate at once, and Mary Claire, the serious one, the premature adult, had begun to play again. She ran through the yard, climbed trees, invented stories. She was being a child once more, and that was a miracle Augustus observed from afar, with a gratitude he did not know how to express. Gertrude, with the wisdom of one who has lived long, noticed everything. She noticed the master's glances, which lingered on Hope's face longer than they should. She noticed the way he found excuses to be present whenever Hope was nearby, and she noticed something in Hope as well, an extra care in the choice of words when the master was in the room, an imperceptible adjustment of posture, a heightened awareness of his presence. Gertrude said nothing, but she worried. Love between masters and enslaved women did not end well. Never in all the history she knew had it ended well. One afternoon, Gertrude called Hope into the kitchen and closed the door. She spoke directly, as was her way. "I see what is happening, child." Hope began to deny it, but Gertrude cut her off with a wave of her hand. "Do not tell me there is nothing. I am old, not blind. And you need to be careful, because if anyone else notices, it will be you who pays." Hope listened in silence. She knew Gertrude was right. She knew that path was an abyss disguised as a garden, but she also knew she was doing nothing wrong. She was not pursuing that man, not provoking, not planning. She was simply existing, and somehow her mere existence was enough to shake the foundations of a world not built to accommodate what was happening. "I have no control over what he feels," said Hope, with a firmness that surprised even herself. Gertrude looked at her for a long moment and then sighed. "I know, child. That is exactly what worries me." Life on the plantation continued its routine, but beneath the surface invisible currents were moving. Augustus began doing things that would once have been unthinkable. He took to dining more slowly so he could observe Hope setting the table. He started asking the girls at bedtime what they had done during the day, something he had never done, knowing the answers would inevitably include Hope. And in a gesture that shocked the entire household, he ordered that a proper wooden bed be built in the quarters for Hope, instead of the straw pallet everyone else used. This gesture did not go unnoticed. The overseer, Vincent, a man with ruddy cheeks and a narrow heart, began to murmur among the other workers. The foreman from the neighboring plantation, who visited regularly, made a scornful remark about the colonel going soft over a negress that nearly cost him his teeth. Augustus heard the phrase from afar, and the fury he felt frightened him more than anything in the past 2 years. To defend her meant to acknowledge she was more than property, and if she was more than property, then what was she? The answer came from Mary Clare, as it always did. The child had an innocent talent for giving voice to truths adults preferred to leave buried. One night under a full moon, as Augustus sat on the porch with his daughters, a new routine Hope had inaugurated, saying the night air was good for children, Mary Clare leaned against him and said, "Father, I wish Hope could be part of our family. Forever." Augustus felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He looked at his daughter, who watched him with that pure expectancy only children can sustain, and found no words. Annabeth, lying in Hope's lap on the swing beside them, was already asleep. Hope sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the stars, pretending she had not heard. But she had heard, and her heart beat so fiercely she was certain everyone could hear it. "Go to bed, Mary Clare," said Augustus, his voice strange. The girl obeyed but cast one last glance at Hope, a glance that said, "I tried." Alone on the porch, save for Annabeth asleep, Augustus and Hope sat in silence for a time that seemed to stretch beyond normal measures. The crickets sang, the moon illuminated the cotton fields, and between them there was something vast and unnameable that occupied every inch of space. It was Augustus who broke it. "You are good for my daughters." Hope waited, sensing there was more. And there was. Augustus continued, each word costing visible effort. "I do not know how to be what they need. I have not known since their mother." He did not finish the phrase, but he did not need to. The silence completed it. He drew a deep breath. "You came here and they became children again. I do not know how to thank you for that." Hope finally looked at him. In the moonlight, his face appeared different, without the lines of hardness, without the mask of the colonel. He was simply a tired, sad, and lost man. "They are easy to love," said Hope with simplicity. Augustus met her eyes and held the gaze for a moment that lasted too long to be casual and too briefly to be a declaration. Then he looked away, cleared his throat, and rose. "Good night," he said, and went inside. Hope remained on the porch, the sleeping child in her arms, and allowed herself to feel what she had been avoiding for weeks. It was dangerous. It was forbidden. It was everything it should not be. But there, in that silent night, with the moon bearing witness without judgment, Hope admitted to herself that the colonel's heart was not the only one being conquered. The months that followed were an exercise in unresolved tension. Augustus and Hope orbited each other like two planets caught in the same gravitational pull, always near, never touching, each hyper-aware of the other's presence. The girls, innocent catalysts of that transformation, continued to weave bonds that drew ever tighter the impossible distance between the two. Augustus changed in ways the entire plantation noticed. He began treating the enslaved people with less harshness, not with kindness, which would be expecting too much, but with a minimal decency that had not existed before. He ceased to administer corporal punishment, delegating to the overseer a discipline he now supervised with greater attention. He ordered a new roof built for the quarters, which leaked in every rain, and to Vincent's outrage he decreed that Sundays would be entirely free, no tasks, no exceptions. No one attributed these changes directly to Hope, at least not aloud. But everyone knew. In the quarters she was regarded with a mixture of admiration and concern. Admiration because she was, even indirectly, improving everyone's lives. Concern because a white master's favors never came without a price. Tobias, an older enslaved man who worked in the stables, was the most open in warning Hope. "You be careful, girl," he said one evening, shelling corn beside her in the quarters. "A master who looks too long at a slave ends up buying and the price ain't in coin." Hope listened, but she already knew what Tobias knew. She already knew that walking upon that razor's edge required a balance few possessed. But there was something Tobias and Gertrude and all the others did not see, something that happened in the small interstices of the day, invisible to anyone not searching for it. It was the moments when Augustus brought a book from town and left it on the parlor table, open to a page with illustrations of flowers, knowing Hope would see it. It was the moments when she prepared a different dish for dinner, and he commented casually that it was good, and that word good carried the weight of 1,000 words left unsaid. It was the quick glances exchanged when no one else was paying attention, glances that said everything words could never say in that world. The crisis arrived, as all crises do, when least expected. The town minister, Reverend Chrysostom, made his monthly visit to the plantation to bless the family and give religious instruction to the girls. He was a thin man with a pointed nose and eyes that saw everything, or believed they did. After the blessing, he sat with Augustus for coffee on the porch, and with the air of someone commenting on the weather said, "I have been hearing things in town, Colonel." Augustus stiffened. "What things?" "They say an enslaved woman has more influence in this house than she ought to. They say the children treat her almost as a mother, and they say," the minister paused calculatedly, "that you distinguish her from the rest in ways that are rather unconventional." Augustus's silence could have frozen the coffee in his cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was steel. "The people of this town would do well to concern themselves less with my house and more with their own." It was a non-answer, and both knew it. The minister departed with a thin smile and a murmured blessing, and Augustus remained on the porch staring at the horizon, feeling the pressure of the world tighten around a feeling he still dared not name. That night, he did not dine with the girls. He locked himself in the study and drank alone, a bottle of aged bourbon he had been saving for occasions that never came. The liquor brought no clarity, but it brought courage, and courage was what he feared most, because courage might make him act, and acting meant crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. It was Hope who knocked on the study door near midnight to say the girls were worried because their father had not come to dinner. Augustus opened the door, and she saw the reddened eyes, the empty bottle, the desolation on his face. "Is everything all right?" she asked, knowing it was not. He looked at her for a long moment. With the liquor dissolving the defenses he kept so carefully erected, he said something he would never say sober. "I no longer know who I am." Hope should have left. She should have lowered her eyes, murmured an apology, returned to the quarters. It was what the rules demanded, what survival counseled, what the world expected. But Hope had never been very good at following the world's rules. "You are a father," she said, looking him in the eye without wavering. "That is what matters." And that truth, so simple, collapsed something inside Augustus that he had not even known still existed. His eyes filled with tears, the first since Eleanor's death, and he turned so she would not see. But she had already seen, and instead of leaving, she stayed. She stood there in silence on the other side of the doorway, being simply a presence, without words, without judgment, without expectation. Simply there. When Augustus finally composed himself, Hope had already gone, but her presence still seemed to fill the study, like the fragrance of a flower that lingers after the flower has been carried away. From that day forward, Augustus stopped fighting what he felt. He did not express it. He still could not in that era, in that society, with those chains that bound him as surely as they bound Hope, though in different ways. But he stopped hiding from himself, and the outward signs were subtle yet unmistakable. He took to bringing the girls to the orchard each morning, where he knew Hope would be gathering fruit for breakfast, and sat in the shade of a peach tree, watching his daughters play under her care. During those mornings, something happened that no one named. They were, for brief moments, a family. Augustus in his corner, Hope with the girls, and between them a silence that was not empty, but full of everything they could not say, of everything they wanted but could not have, of everything that was and should not have been. Mary Claire, perceptive beyond her years, understood more than she let on. During one of those mornings, while her father read and Hope braided Annabeth's hair, Mary Claire sat beside Augustus and said quietly, "You are different when she is near." Augustus looked at his daughter, genuinely surprised. "How do you mean?" "Your face gets less hard. You look like the father from before, the brutal honesty of childhood." Augustus did not reply, But when he looked back at Hope, there was something in his eyes that had no name, or perhaps it did, but he was not yet brave enough to speak it. The real truth surfaced when no one was looking for it. A letter arrived from Augustus's brother Henry, who lived in Charleston. Henry was a practical man devoid of sentimentality, who managed the family's business interests in the city. The letter said, amid formalities and news of cotton prices, that he had found a perfect candidate for Augustus's second wife, Mrs. Leonora Albuquerque, recent widow of a judge, a woman of noble family, a good Christian, who had expressed interest in meeting the colonel. Augustus read the letter in the study, and his body's reaction caught him off guard. His first sensation was not interest, nor indifference, nor gratitude. It was panic. An absurd, irrational panic that rose from his stomach to his chest like a wave of ice. The idea of another woman entering that house, sleeping in the room that had been Eleanor's, sitting at the table with the girls, and occupying the place that, in his mind, already belonged to someone else, was unbearable. And it was in that moment, with the letter crumpled in his hands and his heart thundering in his chest, that Colonel Augustus Whitfield Thornton finally admitted to himself what everyone around him already knew. He was in love with Hope. The admission brought no relief, it brought terror. Because loving an enslaved woman was not merely socially unacceptable, it was, in the structure of that world, an existential impossibility. He was the master, she was property, society, the church, the law, everything would conspire to destroy them if that feeling were exposed. And more than that, how could he be certain that what she felt was real and not survival? How could he be certain she was not yielding to what seemed inevitable for the same reason all enslaved people yielded? Because the alternative was pain. That thought tortured him more than any other. The idea that Hope might reciprocate out of obligation, out of fear, out of a calculus of survival, was so painful it nearly drove him back inside the cocoon of stone where he had lived for the past 2 years. Nearly. What stopped him were the girls. More specifically, it was a scene he witnessed from the bedroom window on a golden late afternoon. Annabeth had fallen and scraped her knee. Nothing serious, merely the monumental tragedy every 5-year-old assigns to minor injuries. Hope scooped her up, cleaned the scrape, blew on the raw skin and did what she always did. She sang. That same ancient song, with a melody that seemed to come from another world. And Annabeth, amid tears that were already drying, hugged Hope around the neck and said, "I love you, my Hope." And Hope replied, her voice thick with emotion, "I love you too, sweet child." And Augustus, at the window, saw in Hope's eyes something that could not be manufactured. It could not be feigned, calculated, or produced under coercion. It was love, pure, genuine, selfless. And if she was capable of loving his daughters like that, with such truth, then perhaps, just perhaps, what he saw in her eyes when their gazes crossed was not submission in disguise. Perhaps it was real. Henry's letter went unanswered. The tension reached its apex during the midsummer celebration, which was observed on the plantation with a bonfire, food, music, and a rare night of freedom for the enslaved. Augustus, who in previous years had hardly appeared, this time stayed from beginning to end. He stood near the fire with a glass of bourbon in his hand, watching everything with the eyes of someone memorizing every detail. Hope was with the girls, who danced around the bonfire with the other enslaved children. Altogether, without distinction, spinning and laughing and stumbling and laughing more. Hope laughed too, an open, carefree laugh that Augustus had never heard. She was beautiful in a way that went beyond the features of her face or the shape of her body. It was the beauty of someone who, at that instant, was entirely alive. And Augustus, who knew death well because he had been living dead inside for 2 years, recognized that life with the reverence of one who recognizes something sacred. At a certain point in the evening, as the children slept on pallets and the elders talked around the embers, Hope slipped away from the group and walked to the orchard, alone. She needed a moment of silence, of fresh air, of a pause in a happiness that frightened her for being so fragile. And there, among the peach trees and magnolias, with the bonfire glowing in the distance and the music fading to a murmur, she found Augustus. He did not say how he had come to be there, and she did not ask. They stood side by side, looking up at the starlit sky, and the silence between them was so charged it seemed to emit sound. It was Augustus who broke it. "I am going to reply to my brother's letter. I will tell him I do not accept his proposal." Hope felt her heart leap, but she kept her voice steady. "That is your decision to make." "It is not my decision," said Augustus, and for the first time, he turned to face her. The light of the distant bonfire illuminated half his face. "It is an impossibility. I cannot bring another woman into my house, I cannot, because it would not be fair to her, nor to my daughters, nor to—" He stopped, the arc of the sentence hanging in the air like an arrow never released. "Nor to whom?" asked Hope, and her voice was barely a whisper. The silence lasted an eternity. The crickets sang, the bonfire crackled, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. "Nor to me," said Augustus at last, "because I could not look at another woman at my table, in my garden with my daughters, knowing that the true reason I am alive again is you." The confession hung between them like a bird that does not know where to land. Hope felt the tears before she realized she was crying. Not tears of joy. One cannot feel simple joy in the face of something so complicated. They were tears of recognition, of validation, of a feeling that had finally found its echo after so long confined to silence. "You know this is impossible," she said, and it was not a refusal but a fact. Augustus laughed. A short, dry laugh, devoid of humor. "I know. Everything in my life that matters is impossible. My wife should not have died. My daughters should not have to grow up without a mother, and I should not have fallen in love with a woman who, before the law, is my property. But all of that happened, and I'm tired of pretending it did not." They stood there for a time neither of them could measure. They did not touch. They did not move closer than they already were. But in that space between them, that space which was, at once, impossible to cross and impossible to maintain, something was completed. Something that until that moment had been one-sided became mutual. And both knew, with the silent certainty of those who recognize a fundamental truth, that their lives would never be the same. In the months that followed, the plantation lived in a kind of suspension. Augustus made no public gesture. He did not declare himself again. He attempted nothing that could compromise Hope. But the atmosphere was different, as if the air had changed its composition, as if the colors were slightly more vivid, as if the very sunlight fell differently upon the big house. The girls flourished. Anna Beth, now 6, was a cheerful, confident child who called Hope my Hope, and demanded her presence at every important moment of her life, which, for a 6-year-old, meant every moment. Mary Claire, at 10, had matured in a healthy way. She maintained her natural seriousness, but now smiled more often and laughed more easily. She had returned to drawing, something she had abandoned after her mother's death, and her drawings included 4 figures: a tall, serious one, father, 2 small ones, herself and her sister, and a 4th, standing beside them, with a wide smile, Hope. Augustus found one of those drawings on the parlor floor and stared at it for long minutes. 4 figures, a family. That was what his daughters saw, that was what they had created without asking permission, without consulting the rules, without caring about what was possible or impossible. In the pure eyes of children, they already were a family, and then came the decision that would change everything. Augustus summoned the town attorney, Mr. Fonseca, a discreet and pragmatic man, and asked him to prepare a document. Not a common letter of manumission. Those existed in abundance and were often not worth the paper they were written on. What Augustus wanted was different. He wanted a document that declared Hope free, that granted her a parcel of land on the plantation, a small lot but fertile near the creek, and that recorded for legal purposes that Hope was the designated guardian of his daughters in the event of his death. Mr. Fonseca listened in silence, his eyebrows rising progressively until they nearly disappeared into his bald forehead. "Colonel," he said carefully, "do you understand the implications of this? A former slave as guardian of white children from a prominent family." Augustus fixed him with the look that made grown men take a step back. "I understand perfectly. Prepare the document." And the document was prepared. Augustus gave Hope her letter of freedom on an autumn afternoon when the garden leaves were beginning to turn gold. He did it without ceremony, without an audience, without drama. He simply appeared in the garden where she was teaching Annabeth to plant seeds and held out the folded paper. Hope opened it, read it, and for a moment, the world stopped turning. Freedom. Not merely freedom, but a home. A place. An existence recognized, documented, protected by law, as fragile as any law could be in that America, yet still more than most enslaved people would ever dare to dream. She looked at him with those deep river eyes and saw a man who, a year before, had been stone and was now earth, still firm but capable of sustaining life. "You do not have to stay," said Augustus, trying to keep his voice steady. "You are free. You may go wherever you wish." It was the most generous and the most terrifying offer he had ever made, because if she left, he knew he would not survive. Not this time. Not after having learned to feel again. Hope held the paper against her chest and smiled for the first time directly at him. Not at the girls, not at Gertrude, not at anyone else. At him. And she said, "Your daughters need me." "My daughters," Augustus repeated, and the nuance escaped neither of them. She stayed, not as a slave, not as a servant. She stayed as a free woman living on the land that was now hers, but spending her days in the big house, caring for the girls she loved and the man who, despite everything, despite every impossibility and every rule, and the entire weight of a society saying no, had found his way back to life through a feeling that began with 2 children and an enslaved woman who knew how to tell stories. The planter's daughters loved her. And unwittingly, without planning, without understanding the magnitude of what they were doing, they made their father fall in love too. Not in the way romantic tales describe, with kisses in the rain and declarations by candlelight, but in a rarer and truer way, through presence, through care, through the constancy of someone who simply arrived and, in arriving, reminded everyone on that plantation that the human heart, no matter how hard it may seem, is a muscle made for beating, and it beats best when it has someone to beat for. And so, at Thornfield Plantation, the woman who arrived with nothing became everything. Not because she conquered, not because she seduced, not because she schemed, but because she loved. And love, even in the most impossible of circumstances, even in the cruelest of times, even when the entire world declares it cannot exist, insists on existing. It insists, persists, and sometimes, against all odds, transforms stone into garden. And that plantation, which bore the name of Thornfield, a field of thorns, finally produced something other than thorns. It produced hope.